Hi, everybody. Welcome to Tuesday night, Insta Live. Just adjusting here a little bit. Okay, so I am bringing on Chumi Friedman tonight from A Time Hug. She is she's the director of the Pregnancy Loss Support Program. And we are going to discuss all things relating to stillbirth tonight. You know, Chumi and I spent a long time discussing lots of different topics. She and I did an Insta Live almost a year ago and talked about the different facets and different programs that A Time offers. But we we made a very tactical decision to not discuss stillbirth at length at the time, because there's so much that is that a lot of misconceptions, a lot of different just talking about how we sort of came to this decision about focusing on stillbirth tonight versus the last time you and I spoke.
Right.
That there's so much that we as a Jewish community just really don't talk about in regard to stillbirth. I mean, look, nobody talks about stillbirth. Like, let's just obviously make that point clear. But you and I just felt, we had this discussion and just felt like there's so many misconceptions about what the different practices are, what different communities do, what's allowed, what's not allowed. And you and I just felt we had to bring this information. Like, God forbid this should happen to anyone you know, should happen to anyone that you love. God forbid a million times. But if it does, that let's at least give people the information so at least they could sort of file it away if God forbid they need it. And I think that's kind of where both of us were coming from. I mean, tell everyone your thoughts. I mean, we don't need to do an introduction. You and I have,
No.
we don't need to be introduced. I don't need to introduce you. You
Right.
don't need to introduce me. We're all good. I mean, just tell me your thoughts. Why, I mean, you came to me and said, we need to talk about this. And so tell me why.
So it's so interesting because two things happened recently. So as you said, nobody talks about stillbirths, even in the general population. It's not like it's just not us, but it's very uncomfortable. It's a very, very, it's a hard thing. It's a hard thing to talk about. It's a hard thing to think about. Nobody wants to think about it. Nobody wants to go there in their heads. And yet it happens. I do think that it's important at the onset that we explain that a stillbirth is a clinical term from a pregnancy that is 20 weeks or more. Most of us think of stillbirths, of stillborn babies, as full-term babies, but clinically they will refer to it from 20 weeks and on. The two things that happened recently, and one of them I have her permission, which is why I'm gonna use her name. I know she's on tonight. And so Peril Heft and her husband unfortunately lost their daughter. They gave birth to a stillborn baby girl a number of months ago. And Peril is a writer, and so she naturally took pen to paper, or blogging in this case, and she blogged about it very, very openly, really exposing herself. And as it was getting closer to Yom Tov time, getting closer to Rosh Hashanah, there was a lot that she was struggling with. Hashkafically, it was just, how do I make peace with God in terms of all this? As an observant woman, how do I do this?
Right.
And she reached out to a publication, who I'm not going to name, an online publication, not anyone that we would consider oh my gosh, so right-wing, they would be afraid. No. She reached out, she sent them one of her essays. She called me and she said they had heavily edited it, taking out a lot of the struggle. But she was going to let it go because she really thought it was important. And then they asked her for a picture. So she said, well, I have a picture of my baby's hands from the hospital, and they wouldn't take it. They said that they thought that it was going to make people uncomfortable.
So what kind of picture were they asking for?
A headshot of her. They wanted just a headshot of her.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
And she called me and she said, my baby's hands are going to make people uncomfortable. She said, like, basically, like, I don't know what to do with this,
right.
So we discussed her goals, what her goal was in wanting to get it printed. And based on those goals, she took it back. She let them know they're not, she's no longer offering it to them. And instead, she sent it to Nashim magazine. Okay. And they took it. Okay. They ran it unedited, and with a picture of the baby's hands. And she told me that within a short while, 6 women had reached out to her afterwards. So that really, really struck me. It's that we can't talk about the struggle. We have to talk about the struggle. Right. And that we can't show the baby's hands. Anybody who saw the picture, you wouldn't have known you were looking at the hands of a baby who wasn't alive. So that was one thing. And then just recently, I had a phone call from a woman who her loss was about 5 months ago. She's still a full-term, stillborn baby. And she said to me, nobody gets it. She has one child, Baruch Hashem, she has one child. And she said just recently, over Yontif, her mother-in-law made a comment, when you have a second baby, then you'll... And she said to me, I walked out of the room and I cried because I had a second baby. Right. She said, it's like this baby doesn't exist. It doesn't exist for anyone. So that really, that sits with me because we can't acknowledge it. And how are we how's anybody supposed to deal with it? Right. So that pain of,
right. Yeah. Right. So I think there are, like, look, we have, 50 some odd minutes, right? Like, yes. we can't cover everything, but I think what I think let's try to do, let's try to bring to people is let's try to bring to them 2 pieces. One, practically, when a couple is going through a stillbirth, God forbid, when they get that news, from the moment they get that news until, let's call it, after the baby is delivered, and let's call it within that first month, let's say, let's talk about the process in terms of what they're going through and the different pieces and the choices that they can make and they can do. And then let's also talk about everyone else in their lives and how they can be supportive from the moment that the couple finds out for the rest of their lives. Right. So let's break it down that way. Does that sound good?
Okay. Sounds good. Okay.
So I want to, like, and using Peril, right? You said was her name? So using Peril. So if we use any couple or using Peril, so you get that call, I get that call, or there's another organization that gets the call.
Yes.
There's a woman who, had a full-term stillbirth. Let's use a full term because I think it's easier for people to understand when people, like, initially when they think about stillbirth in their head, even though obviously from a medical standpoint, it is a baby that's 20 weeks gestation or greater. The woman is 36 weeks and she thought that everything was fine. And all of a sudden she, didn't feel movement anymore, went into the doctor and there's no heartbeat. Okay. So there's the shrieking and the yelling and the screaming and the absolute just horror and bereavement. And she calls her husband and maybe calls some of her family members. But then someone usually says, okay, you need to call who? Because what are the next steps that happens to this family?
So it could be a number of things. There could be, they have a doula that they were already working with, right? So nowadays doulas are much more of a an aid, so to speak. So it could be that they have a doula that they're working with, and she may reach out to her doula and say, I need to let you know there's no heartbeat. And maybe the doula is going to go with her anyway. Maybe the doula feels comfortable. Maybe the doula doesn't and says, I don't know what to do about that. Right. So,
right. So the first piece, right?
Yeah.
The first piece is the delivery. That's
is the delivery. Absolutely. The delivery, right. What are we doing? Are we going into the hospital now? Is the doctor saying we have no beds, come in a few hours? So the first piece is the delivery. Usually in the hospital, there's a period of time in which other things can be taken care of because nobody's walking in and delivering immediately. There's going to be a process here.
Right.
So it's usually during the process that a call will go maybe to a Rav, to their rabbi, if they have one, maybe to one of the organizations, if they don't know what to do and they just feel very lost. So then it's, let's put the pieces of this puzzle together. What are we doing now? What do we have to do? And a lot of times that's what the call is. I don't know what to do. What do I do?
Now what? Right. And
Right.
so then the choices become things like, the doctor usually dictates how the delivery is going to happen, whether the delivery is going to be by natural delivery or by C-section. So we're not going to deal with the medical piece. That's not what we do. We deal with everything else. So then there are choices. Choices. Do the parents want to see the baby afterwards? Do they not want to see the baby? Do the parents want to hold the baby or touch the baby or spend time with the baby? There are some parents who want to spend lots of time with the baby, even up to hours or days. Yes. I've heard of in certain situations in the Jewish community and in the non-Jewish community. And in the hospital setting, and there is the ability for the parents to spend time with the baby in that way.
Yes.
Do we want to know anything about this baby at all? Do I want to even know whether the baby was a boy or a girl?
Right.
If I do know, do I want to give the baby a name?
Right.
What kind of, and then the questions are also about burial.
Yes.
Who is going to bury the baby? Where is the baby going to be buried? Who is going to take care of that? When the baby is buried, who's going to officiate that service? What kind of service is it going to be? So there are lots of different kinds of questions that immediately come up. And I think for everyone sort of watching this, I think what you have to think about is these are parents who have just been delivered the most horrific news that they could possibly deliver. It is news that no one should ever have to hear in their entire life. And so then they're immediately faced with this medical situation of having to deliver this baby. And then the list grows and grows and grows of decisions that need to be made. And these decisions need to be made usually in a pretty quickly. And so that's when people start to reach out to different organizations, their parents, to different rabbeim, different rabbis, to try to get these answers. So go ahead.
Okay, so let's just say that halachically speaking,
so from a Jewish law perspective, halacha means Jewish law. Go ahead.
Yes. From a Judaic law perspective, parents, grandparents, siblings, even if that is the parent's choice, are 100% allowed to see the baby, hold the baby, spend time with the baby. There's no issue with doing that. A lot of people think that because Judaic law does prescribe certain things for dead bodies, we don't touch dead bodies, we don't look at dead bodies, we don't.
For grown-ups, those laws exist for grown-ups or anyone who is older than a certain age, not for a baby.
Not for a baby. These laws are completely different for these babies. So this becomes very much personal choice. And we always tell parents the same thing. There's no right, there's no wrong. It's what you feel at that moment. And we tell them all the time, you can't know how you're going to feel until the baby comes. So they're going to ask you, the nurses are going to bring it up But you have every right to say, I don't know what I'm going to do. Because until that baby's born, you don't know.
Right.
And then you make the best decision you can make at that moment. And that's it. And if the decision is, I want to see the baby, then you see the baby. The decision is, I want to hold the baby, then you hold the baby. I want to sing to the baby. I want to, people say to him, whatever it is that people want to do. So that is 100%. Now, that being said, certain communities have certain ways of doing things. And I always tell people, if you have a rabbi, somebody that you feel close to, somebody that you feel comfortable with, that's your decision whether or not you ask what your community does. And then, what should I tell you?
Right. Right. I think that's a lot of times where people get stuck. And I've heard lots of different stories, both, just from my own experience working in this specific nonprofit, and also when I used to work with Nechama Comfort. I think what happens is that in a situation like a stillbirth, and especially in a situation where the families aren't necessarily familiar with Jewish law, what will happen is that one family member will say, oh, I know this rabbi, you should call him or her. And that rabbi won't necessarily know that there's a distinction between a baby that is a dead body versus a grown-up or an older child that is a dead body. And so therefore will prescribe, so to speak, and say to these parents, you can't hold your baby, you can't touch your baby, you can't do anything with your baby, when in fact Jewish law doesn't say that. And so it's a lot of these times it gets very murky, and what ends up happening afterwards is sometimes the parents then find out that they could have had that opportunity, and that's what causes a tremendous amount of anguish and a tremendous amount of psychological pain, sometimes for their life. And so what I always say to people is, don't just go and find that one relative or that one person. Take, and even if you have that rabbi who is your closest rabbi and the person who you always go to for lots of other decisions in your life, try to understand what the range of Jewish law here is, and try to understand the absolute most that you could be doing versus the minimum that you could be doing. And so you don't end up regretting this at some point down the line. So I
will just say, because you touched on regret, it's one of the things we tell parents afterwards. You can't regret the decision that you made at that moment, because you made it for that moment. It was the best decision, and you can't go back and say, oh, but maybe. You can't. So it really becomes in that moment. I once had a father tell me he had chosen not to see the baby. I can't tell you what he was going through. He was suffering horrifically because of it, and we all just kept telling him the same thing. You can't do this. You made the decision. You felt it was the right decision. And now let's talk about living with this. You can't. So that, I think, is really, really important. There's no right. There's no wrong. It's really very, very personal. I think it's important that people know there are options.
Yes. Yes, and I also think one of the other pieces that happens in the hospital is also the memory box that the hospitals do. I think it's law. I don't know if it's I think it must be state law. I'm not sure about that. But the bottom line is that most hospitals, if not all hospitals, do put together what's called a memory box for this child. It's of the child, and it's for the parents. And inside the memory box is the birth certificate of the baby's footprints. It could be the little outfit that they dressed the baby in. If the baby had any hair, sometimes they'll take a lock of hair of the baby. And a lot of times also, just speaking about this regret, because I want to just touch on this now, parents decide Some parents decide they don't want to know anything about the baby. They don't want anything to do with this memory box. The hospital takes the memory box, and sometimes they'll store it away somewhere. But sometimes what happens is months later, years later, that yes, the life is being saved. So I just wanted to tell everybody we're being saved, God willing. None of this is in our hands, God willing. So what can happen is that parents ask for the memory box at some point down the line, because at some point they decide that they do want to see whatever tangibly was left of their babies. And so what I always recommend is that there's somebody in the family that knows where that memory box is, that somebody holds, is the keeper of the information. And so or maybe that's the family member that takes the box home. Maybe that's the family member that knows which administrator in the hospital or which office houses the memory box. But somebody has that information in case the family wants to know at some point down the line.
And very often they do. Sometimes they, a lot of times, depending on the situation, sometimes you have a difference of opinion between the mother and the father, right? You've got a couple, and they're both dealing with this, and she wants to see and hold the baby, and he doesn't think it's a good idea.
Yep.
He doesn't want to do it. And that's something that is very, very key to navigate. And one of the things we always tell couples is, okay, he doesn't have to see and hold the baby.
Right.
You don't agree on everything, and that's okay. We have to agree on everything. So very often you have a situation where he's thinking it's bad enough she saw the baby and she held the baby, we can't take this box home. I just had a situation very recently. I have somebody's memory box in our office. She wanted to see it, she wanted to look at it, but she didn't want it in the house. I said, okay, so we'll hold it for you and you'll know that we have it. And, and the other thing I think is very important about the memory box, it's okay to make the molds. A lot of times hospitals offer a mold of the hand or a mold of the baby's foot.
Right.
You can do that. It's fine. People have asked about rings. A lot of times there are memory, rings that the hospitals will give out. To a number of hospitals, we've said, put the ring on the baby's hand, which is what we sell. People can do whatever they want.
Right.
Put the ring on the baby's hand, take a picture, and give a picture to the mother, because they're not going to bury the baby with the ring.
Right.
So,
right, because Jewish law states that the babies have to be buried just without anything. Right.
Right. So maybe let's go to the burial.
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay.
So
take this for a very long time.
Yes.
Okay. So the burial. Again, different communities have different ways of doing things, and that's okay. What's important for people to know is that there isn't uniformity in how things are done in various communities. In some communities, especially as we get more and more and more to the right, parents will not be permitted to be at the burial, to even know where the baby is buried. The interesting thing is that if you live out of town, that's not necessarily true. It doesn't matter how far along to the right of the spectrum you are, just by virtue of where you are, the way the Chevra Kadisha burial society is set up. A lot of times the fathers are the ones going, whereas the same father in the New York, New Jersey area would not be permitted
to go. Other burial societies will 100%, the parents can be a part of it. Parents could put down a marker if they want. In certain communities, you're not going to be able to put down a marker. So I think it's important to know what you want to do, and then reach out to the person, the organization that most reflects those values for you, so that you're making a good choice and not coming back afterwards and saying, why didn't somebody tell me?
Absolutely. And I'll just I'll expand on that and say,
yes,
there are a range of possibilities. One second, I just see that there's a question here. Yeah, we'll deal with that. What if the father's a cohen? We'll get to that in a second. But there are a range of possibilities in terms of exactly as you were saying, in terms of the kinds of burial and also the knowledge that's given to the parents. So all the way on one side, exactly as you said, is that the baby is taken away by the Chevra Kadisha, the burial society, and they are the ones who give the baby the name. They are the ones who...
They don't have to give the baby the name,
okay.
by the way. Right.
Okay.
Right. But yes.
Thank you. Okay.
Yes.
And they're the ones who find the cemetery and find the plot and find the area in the cemetery, and they're the ones who bury the baby, and they're the ones who know where that baby is buried, period, end of story. And no one else knows, and no one else can know. In
Right.
certain communities, that is the way it's done. If you move a little bit more lenient, you can have the burial society take the baby, but the burial society will take the baby and bury the baby in a spot where you know where the baby is buried, so you can go and visit the baby. You can put up a headstone. You can do you can have anyone visit that baby and know exactly where the baby is. And I think if you go even a little bit more lenient, and I will say that this is all within the spectrum of what's allowed. It really just depends on where you fall in this spectrum and what your community generally does. There are many families that I know that have planned their own funeral services, that where both parents have spoken or just the parents have spoken, where they've had invited family, they've invited friends to these services, and then everyone or just certain people go to the cemetery to help bury the baby, or there's just a service at the cemetery with a father, a mother, both, and maybe a couple of other people with the rabbi. So there are lots of different possibilities. The real question is where you hold, where your family holds, and what you're comfortable with. So, and I've also, just to put into people's heads, also, there is a possibility of once you, if you're of the certain community who wants to know where your baby is buried, your baby can be buried in a separate plot. Your baby can be buried in a plot that in an area of the cemetery that's designated for these babies, or your baby can also be buried on a plot that a family plot where a grandparent or another relative has been buried already, and that what they do is they just dig out part of that specific plot and they bury the baby there. So there are lots of different possibilities if you're directing this piece of the puzzle, I will say.
And in terms of the name, even if you're part of a society in which you're not going to know where the baby is buried, 100% parents can name the baby. And we always say, just on the form, you put the name that you want the baby to have, and they will honor that. If you don't choose a name, and many parents choose not to pick a name, then the burial society will choose one. But 100% parents can, if and very often they do. They have a name that means something to them, and that they want the baby to have that name. So that's definitely in terms of shiva. So, Judaic law does not require shiva for these babies. But I want to just say that I always tell mothers, I always tell couples, and I tell this to their extended family if we're talking to them, if it was different, they would be sitting shiva. So treat them as if they are. Give them that time and space and that allowance of, I'm mourning and I'm suffering. Just because we don't have the ritual, we don't need to have the ritual for these babies. So just because we don't have it doesn't mean that the emotions and the feelings and all of the grief and the pain isn't as if we were having it.
Right. And there are some families who do choose to do sort of their own version of shiva, meaning, not with because the rules don't apply per se, because this baby was under 30 days of life, what would have been considered to be full term for that baby. So some families choose to do, like, they tell their friends, they tell their relatives, they say, we're not sitting a proper shiva, but, in the evenings between, 7 and 9 o'clock, if you want to come over and visit with us, we'd love to see you, and they, talk about the baby and do that. So
Right.
it's not a typical Shiva, but but a lot of families will often do this sort of modified Shiva so that they can feel the community's support in that way, and feel that sort of enveloped warmth in a way that they wouldn't have typically been otherwise been given that opportunity.
Right.
So it's really because there are no laws here, you can kind of do what works for you. And many rabbis can guide you in that way also.
Mm-hmm. People ask me also about, which I'm sure you've gotten that question, about lighting a candle. Do you add a candle for the baby? And it's also, it's personal choice. Some people do. Some women even use a special candle holder that this will always be for this baby. And some people don't. And
right, we're talking about, just to explain for a second, so we're talking about lighting Shabbos candles, lighting candles for the Sabbath. And what typically is done in a family is that when someone gets married, they light 2 candles, one for themselves and one for their husband. And then when each child is born, in some communities, people then add a candle. So if you have 2 children, then you're lighting 4 candles. If you have 4 children, you're lighting 6 candles. So the question goes back to, so now what? Do I light a candle for this child? And the answer is a beautiful one. The answer is that there's no answer.
Right. There really is no answer. The only thing I tell people is that just know once you add the candle, you can't take it back. So you may be faced with somebody, maybe even one of your children, at some point asking. And so some women, even if they sort of feel maybe they should or they want to, but they don't, and that's okay. There's no set. It's the same thing with the yahrzeit. The yahrzeit or again, we're not commemorating it in the same way, but at the same time, we want you to commemorate it. We're not forgetting. No mother is forgetting her child. No matter where the loss happens on the spectrum, we all know that no woman forgets. So how much more so a baby that you have held, that you have spoken to, that you have bonded with, and yes, commemorate that baby's day. Again, in some manner, shape, or form.
Right. And I'll also say, and because I've heard this a lot, I had a stillbirth. I've had people ask me, I had a stillbirth 4 years ago and I never lit a candle, but now I really want to light a candle. Can I? Right. Or I never lit a yahrzeit candle, but I always know what day it is. I know this was the day that I gave birth. I know this was the day. Can I start lighting one? And the answer is yes. Right. You can decide to do any of those things, any of these things at any point in your life. Once you do it, it's probably a good idea to keep doing it. But if you haven't been doing it and tomorrow you decide, or today is Tuesday. So on Friday, if you decide, this week I want to start lighting a candle for my child, then you can do that.
Right. I know people who light for their grandparent, who add, light candles. So it's the same sort of thing that you can. It's so interesting that there is very little set structure for something that is as ancient as mankind. And I always think that part of the reason that is because there is no one way to grieve this. There just isn't. Right. So,
Right. And we, you and I and so many of the other organizations, we talk about this a lot, right? Some people choose to honor their baby in such a way. Other people choose to bury their baby in such a way. Other people choose to memorialize their baby in this way. There's no right way to do this. The right way to do it is the way that feels meaningful to you. And also, I really love what you said about making the choices at the time which feel right to you, and to try not to have regret about it. Like, I think everybody is going to live with a little bit of regret of I should have, or I could have, or I might have, but
Right.
under an in this incredibly stressful situation, each of you are making the decisions that were right for you at that moment with the information that you had at the time. And so for that, I think both of us, I really wanted to give to all of you this peace and grace, knowing that you made the right decision for you, and try not to live with so much regret. This is a lot. This is a lot. Okay, I know there are 1,000 other questions. I want to get to the what happens, but before we get to the other people in the family, the other people in the community, and what we can do to support. But this question of what happens if the father is a cohen? So what happens if the father is of the priestly class? So that's specifically in Jewish religion. There are different classifications, and typically when someone is a cohen, they can't be around a dead body, and they're also not supposed to visit cemeteries. So tell me about your thoughts about when a father is a cohen.
I know what I think. I tell him to ask his rabbi. Am I losing you? Okay, I didn't know if you heard, because I thought I lost for a second. But yeah, I know what I think. Right, I know what I think, and I know what, if, I always say, please ask your, just because I'm not getting into somebody calling me later and saying, by the way, you should just, no. Speak to your rabbi, and whatever he tells you, if you don't have a rabbi, I can put you in touch with ours if you like, and you can have a conversation with him and what he's going to tell you. I've had people say to me, my husband can't be there. I'm like, oh, I'm done. Like, okay, fine, if that's what you were told.
Right.
Let's discuss who else is going to be there then. How else are we supporting you?
Right.
And that's, yes.
Right. Look, I think, without getting, I don't think both of us are not, stepping into the area of Jewish law where we're making any decisions for anyone. But I think with when you have a good rabbi, any good rabbi takes every individual circumstance and every person's specific situation into account when they're giving you their decision. And so with every law, there is always room to maneuver. And I think anytime there is even a possibility of a question, like things that seem black and white are never usually black and white, and there is usually a lot of gray. And so I think both of us are basically saying the same thing. When you if you have a question, even if you think the answer is no, especially in this specific situation, when there's so much emotional stress and turmoil that's happening here in this unexpected tragedy, please ask your rabbis, please ask the people that you go to, and ask them if there's any room to maneuver here.
Right. I think it's so important to remember that really in any situation, but most especially in these, like you said, there is never anything wrong with asking a question. Always better you should ask and be told no, than you assume the answer is no, and the answer might have been yes.
Yes.
And
I always say that in regard to all Taras HaMishpacha rules, in all laws of family purity. Whenever we think the answer is no, often there are ways to have the answer be yes. So absolutely.
Absolutely.
Okay, Chumi. Now, let's now go to your second example. The woman whose baby unfortunately was stillbirth 5 months ago, and her mother-in-law said, "Oh, when you have your second baby," but this was her second baby. And so what do we do? How can we possibly explain to everyone how a child is a child is a child, and this, especially a stillbirth? And I look, you and I talk a lot about how a loss is a loss is a loss. There are people that we know, there are families that we've dealt with that have had 5-week miscarriages, 6-week miscarriages, and are completely depressed, can't get out of bed, can't function, and really need a significant amount of help in order to be able to go back to their regular lives.
Yes.
And on the flip side, you and I also know that there are many families that we deal with that have full-term stillbirths, or even an infant loss or a neonatal loss. And the parents or one parent seems to just sort of like snap back into it, like move on with life, and back in the grocery store, they're back in synagogue, they're back, doing play group and, going on play dates and doing all sorts of other things, coffee dates, as if nothing happens. And so what's the right answer here? And so what does that also mean for everyone else in their lives? Like, how do we handle sort of both ends of the spectrum here?
So it's exactly that. It's, you have to meet them where they are. You can't presume if she is or he is in abject mourning, then that's where you meet them, in that place of mourning. And if he or she isn't, that's where you're going to meet them as well. It's never our place to be putting our thoughts, our ideas, our emotions on another person. It's really, what does she need? And if you're close enough to her or to him, they're going to share because they need to share. And if they're not sharing, then you need to respect that as well. That's really, really hard. I say this all the time. As a mother of grown-up children, it is very, very hard to step back and say, this is not about me. This is not about what I think. This is not about how I would handle it. This is not about what I want to do. What does he or she need? What does he or she need from me? And how do I go about providing that? And usually they're giving off clues. Maybe we're not seeing them because we don't want to. And let's admit that somebody else's pain is very, very uncomfortable. We may be okay in the short term. I can handle your pain in the short term, but I can't handle long-term pain because I need for you to be past this because this is not comfortable for me anymore. I don't know how to do this. I can do this, for the first week, but I can't do this 5 months later. I can't do this, 2 months later. I can't keep talking about this because we need to move on. We can't keep belaboring this point. Like, you need to move on. But that's not necessarily the way grief works. No, it doesn't. And so it's funny, Yonina Kaufman, who's our clinical coordinator at ATAMA, one of the things that we talk about very, very often is the safe space. Who is your safe space? Because we all know that our husbands, for example, our spouses, they're not going to be everything for us. We're not going to be everything for them. That's not how it's supposed to be. So who is that person or persons that you can call up 5 months later and say, I can't breathe today.
Yeah.
I can't breathe.
I'm having a terrible day. I can't, you just need to get me out of here. Yeah.
And that happens. And unfortunately, sometimes that's not our parents. And sometimes it's not our siblings. And sometimes it's not even our best friend. Sometimes it's the least possible person who somehow or another gets it. And we know that. We know this person gets it. Sometimes it could be family if we've taken the time to make our feelings clear. This woman who said to me, about when you have a second child, I said to her, you don't feel that you can say something to her. I understand. She's your mother-in-law. You don't feel you can. Can your husband? Can your husband say to her?
Can someone? Right.
No, but I said, can your husband say it? I said, even, why did I say her husband? I said, because even if your husband will say it to her and it won't make a difference, you're going to be surprised how just the fact that he said it for you is going to make a difference for you.
Absolutely.
And we also recommended that she see a therapist because she's really struggling with this. So that's it. Very often people will say, do I need therapy?
Another really, really, really great question, and a very common question, right? I had a stillbirth. Do I need therapy? Do we need couples therapy? Do my children, if you have other children, do they need therapy? Like, I want to make sure I do everything right. Like, I want to do this grieving thing right. So what do I need to do?
What do I need to do?
What do I need to do to make it right?
Right.
And the answer always is, you don't need anything.
Right.
Grieving also sometimes, like, obviously it's a very individual process for every person, but also sometimes, like, you need to, like, sort of sit with it a little bit. You need to really see how you're going to react. Obviously, you want to have we could do a whole other live in terms of conversations that you can have with your children about how to discuss death, how to discuss miscarriage, et cetera. That's a different live. But yes, you can talk to a professional and in terms of getting advice in regard to that. But do you automatically need therapy just because you've been through a tragedy in your life?
Right.
No.
No.
But if you want that extra support, then therapy is always a really great thing. But do you need it? No.
Most of the time.
Right.
Most of the time. We always say, I always tell women, why do you think you should know how to do this? What has happened in your life that makes you think you are capable of doing this alone? Sometimes you're not. It's a skill set you never needed. And now all of a sudden, it's affecting everything that happens in your life. And yeah, you may need it. And very often people will say to me, I can't do that whole therapy thing. I'm like, it's skills. You need skills. Rabbi Koenig, the director of our medical helpline, he always says, if your car breaks down, do you expect to know how to fix it? No, that's not part of it's not tool in your tool belt, right? You go to a pro. Maybe you're going to hang around by the car because you want to know how to fix it, but it's not a tool you have. So this is the same thing. You may not have the tools. You may need to reach out and speak to somebody who does, who can help guide you, because lots of things will come up that you weren't expecting. And that, I think, is also a very, very important key. Sometimes sometimes the husband calls and he says, I don't know what to do with her. Why do you have to do anything with her? Just let her be. She just needs to be. And sometimes they need a little bit of help. We've reached a point where, like, we're at a crossroads here. And, and sometimes you need the therapist to say, by the way, she's really okay. Yes. And to sort of, like, right. But it is its own package.
Yeah. Right. Absolutely. And I think, look, I think for everyone else in their lives, I think, for you, for the couple, you're going through your own process. Everyone else doesn't understand that process because most of the time they haven't been through it. But I think what you can do as the family member, as the friend, as the community member, is you can check in with them. Like, check in with them, see how they're doing. It is you talking to them and saying, hey, how are you? I've been thinking about you. Or I know today if you remember, even a few months later, or even a year later, if you remember the baby was born around Hanukkah time, for example, and Hanukkah time is coming, you can reach out and say, hey, I remember your baby was born around now. How are you doing? Do you want to go out for coffee? Do you want to sit and talk with me? I'm here to sit. I'm here to listen to you. I think the piece that people are worried that if they bring up the baby, if they start talking about the baby, that it's going to make the couple feel worse. It's going to make them be more sad than they already are. And the reality is that as we started out all of this with, people are not going to forget their babies.
No.
It's something that will stay with them for their entire lives. And so by you reaching out to someone and saying, hey, I'm thinking about you. I hope you're not struggling today, but if you are, I'm here for you. It's you reaching out and being a genuine friend, as opposed to you putting more of a dagger in her heart. You could never do that. And we'll take that more as, wow, this person really cares about me. And
Right.
this person really wants to make sure that I'm okay. And they know that this is something that I'm sitting with. So
Right.
what I always say to people is, it is always a good idea to reach out. It is always a good idea to say things, or to text or to email and say things like, hey, I'm thinking about you. I was at the grocery store and I saw these cookies that you really like. I'm going to be dropping them off later.
Right.
Or, you know, in 3 months, I made this soup that you really like. And I also picked up one of those magazines. I'm going to drop them off. Like,
Right.
it's always a good idea to be overly solicitous and tell people that you're thinking about them and that they're on your minds. They will never, not in a pushy way, not in a pushy way,
Right.
not like,
Right.
you need to come talk with me and you need to come sit with me and you need to this. It's more, I'm just letting you know I'm here if you want it. And I'm dropping these things outside your door. You don't
Right.
need to talk to me. You don't need to interact with me. This is just my way of letting you know that I care.
Right. And so 2 things also I think very important. We forget about the husbands. I once had a man call me and he said to me, this is going to sound terrible what I'm saying to you, but it's all about her. He said, even things that are being dropped off at the house are like, I made her muffins. He's like, I'm standing here. I'm not a person, you know, and
I'm
really,
also the father, and I also lost a baby.
right. And I think it's so important they get lost. They really, really get lost. Number 1, we don't see them. We don't see that they're mourning. Number 2, they're usually so focused on what they can do for her. And if there are other children in the house, holding the whole family together and being that strong, silent support system, they need support. They really, really need support. The other thing is, again, take your cues. If she doesn't want something from you and she says something like, thanks, but I'm good, believe her.
Amazing.
Just,
Yep.
Right. Don't
force yourself into someone's life because you think that you know better and you want to help. And so therefore you're going to, even though she's pushing you away. Absolutely.
Right. And especially I find this, women who have been there. You don't know what she's going through. You can know what you went through when it happened to you, but you're not her. So you can't, it's never going to be exactly the same. It can't be. And so what worked for you may be the complete opposite of what's going to work for her. And I say this as a mother and as a mother-in-law, we're sometimes the worst. And it's a terrible thing that when a woman is experiencing a loss, and such a traumatic loss, that she shouldn't be able to know that her mother or even her mother-in-law is just the warm, comforting presence. Just be there for her. It's just so, so important on that level. And so many times it's not. And I'm not minimizing the pain of a grandparent. There is a tremendous amount of pain as a grandparent when this is happening. Bless you. Bless you. And I always tell, go ahead. Bless you.
Okay, good. Go ahead.
And I tell the grandmothers, you need support. You need to have your person who you're picking up the phone to. And showers were made for crying. Everybody should know this. Whatever your situation is, the showers were made for crying. I say, you need your person because you're going to need, but you need to be the rock for her.
Right.
You know, so many pieces to
so
this.
many pieces. Look, we're not going to cover all of the pieces,
No.
but I think this gives people a good snapshot into some of the broad overpoints. I don't even think that's a word. I'm going to start again. The broad picture.
There you go.
There we go. The broad picture of the different kinds of circumstances that people fall. Okay, my words are escaping me now.
Yeah,
you talk. Go.
It's basically we've given you a picture of what could be, of what should be, and what shouldn't be, and hopefully this live is just going to sit doing nothing because no one's ever going to have a loss again.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you for helping me there, because I was struggling with
Yeah.
my words.
It's okay.
That was
Don't worry
beautiful.
about it. Okay.
And if anyone has any questions about any of the points that Chumi or I mentioned, or have any questions in regard to any other aspects of stillbirth or miscarriage or any part of grieving, please reach out. Look,
Yeah.
this is a very fluid kind of situation. There are no right answers. There are no wrong answers. And the best thing that any of you can do, that all of us can do, is just try to meet people exactly as you said, meet them where they are, and
Right.
to support them the best way that we know how.
Yeah.
And that's it. Chumi, always, always,
Thank
always
you.
a pleasure. I wish we
Thank
were
you.
talking
Thank you.
about
I
something
know.
a little bit happier. I
We
mean,
could do chocolate chip cookies next time.
yes, okay, chocolate chip cookies. But
Yes.
look, I mean, you know, the two of us can do this because we work with this community and these individuals all day long, and we can have these kinds of conversations without breaking down in tears,
Right.
because this is something that we do all day long. But it doesn't take away from the fact that this is something that people should only experience. Should experience absolutely at no point in their life, but if they do, that there are people out there that can help and can help support you wherever you are in the Jewish community.
Yes, absolutely, for sure. We always say we never ask anybody, you know, we never ask for affiliations when the phone rings. It's just,
Right.
how can we help? What can we do to help you? Right.
Correct. Exactly.
Thank you,
All right.
Amy, as always. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Okay. Good night.
Bye, everybody.
Take care. Bye.